Hey, this is Phoebe from Breaking Light Productions, and I'm back with another custom doll video. Today's project is this Cottagecore forest witch, so if you want to see how I made her, stick around. Let's get started. For this time, I tried to get things started off right and actually do some concept art for it first. I found a monster high croquis, or person-shaped fashion sketch, to draw my design over it. I thought green skin would be perfect for a witch, and I picture her living in the forest and making potions out of the various plants and ingredients that she finds there, so I wanted to give her a cottagecore aesthetic. And I fell in love with the idea of a practical wool jumper over an exuberant, multicolored patchwork skirt. And I liked that so much that I decided to do a second draft of this and split the jumper a little bit higher so that you could see more of the skirt peeking through, making that kind of the centerpiece of the design. I also did a sketch to plan the face up. Again, pardon my amateurish drawing skills, but this should give you at least a little bit of the idea. I want to shade the face with green and have large purple eyes as an accent color, but my style of drawing doesn't really convey the expression I'm going for. She looks a little bit sly and mysterious, but I want her to look more eager and friendly and like she'd just be delighted to share everything she's learning about magic with you. The broken down relic will be giving new life this time, a Generation 1 Frankie Stein. She's clearly pretty old and was, shall we say, well-loved in her previous life. I researched what version of Frankie she is, and based on the dark red lips, the purple eyeshadow, and the bangs pulled straight back from the forehead, I think she may actually have been one of the very first release. She also has elastic hips, which, as far as I know, only the very early dolls had, so she might even be an original. Clearly she's going to need a lot of sprucing up, though. First, we will whack off this hair, which has a lot of glue traveled up into it from the head, and it feels really greasy and gross. Then I soften it up with the heat from a hairdryer and pull it off the neck peg. That way I can use the neck hole to pull out the remaining glue and hair plugs left inside. Unfortunately, everything about the head cleanup process was way harder than it should have been. This doll's head was full of old glue, which had long since seeped out into the roots, making them sticky. It was to the point that when I was trying to scrape it out from the inside of the head, the glue would pull away and leave the plugs stuck in the holes behind. Before long, the doll head was covered with glue, my hands were, my tools were, and I had no choice but to pull out the little broken plugs from the surface of the scalp rather than from the inside. That was long and tedious. Once I'd gotten out as much as I could, I decided to let it soak in some boiling water and dish soap just to hopefully get the glue off a little bit more. Getting the face off proved to be another pain. The head looked and felt pretty clean, but then when I tried to start wiping off the face with acetone, the paint seemed to get trapped in some kind of residue that was left behind, probably from the glue. Previously, I'd found the face pretty easy to take off, but this time required constantly switching for fresh tools and using a ton more acetone, just so that I was actually removing the paint rather than just pushing it around. This is about as clean as I was able to get it, even though it's definitely not perfect. I even, with all the acetone I used, got a little bit of this bright yellow paint from my cutting mat dissolved and it transferred to the doll, which I'm not happy about. But she's an old doll, and I guess I shouldn't be surprised she's going to take a lot of work to bring back to life. Now let's fix up the body. I want to get rid of these stitches that Frankie has painted on her skin, but I can't just use acetone like on the face because acetone will melt the kind of plastic that the body is made of. Instead, I'm going to use nail files to sand off the paint, with a little bit of help from the pliers to pull off the neck bolts, which then also get sanded smooth. I'm also hoping to remove some of the seam lines that are visible from the doll's manufacturing process, just because I think the smoother look makes it look a little bit higher quality, and it also might be helpful in taking off some of the yellowing that's begun on the plastic, which happens as the dolls get older. So she didn't turn out perfect, as you can see, but I think it's good enough given most of her body will be covered by clothes. I decided to wash the doll after that. I'm just using regular old dish soap and water to get off all the dust particles from sanding, and of course the years of accumulated dirt she had on her. Plus I wanted to make 100% sure that I got all the glue off the head that had transferred from the inside to the outside when I was pulling out the plugs. Then I just laid her out on a dish towel to air dry in her own time. Huh, she looks pretty good. I also already replaced the elastics in her hip joints. If you want to see the process for that, check out the link of my previous video of making my custom centaur in the description box below. Next comes the hair rooting. For this doll, I decided a wild fall of Merida-style red curls was in order. I really like how this dusty orange color goes with the mint green. I know, I also gave wavy yarn hair to my last project too, and this is pretty similar. I just love this kind of texture. I'm hoping that because these fibers are thinner and have tighter kinks, it'll have a slightly different effect. But I promise, my next doll will have nylon hair or combed wefts or something totally different so it doesn't get boring to watch. For now, though, doesn't it just look so good? Now let's actually get the stuff in her head. For this reroot, I'm going to pick up the strands of yarn 2 at a time because they're thinner. And I'm going to root in a pattern that takes into consideration the ultimate hairstyle that I want to do. Again, call me uncreative, but I'm going to do a half up, half down style again. But this time, the character's going to be wearing a witch's hat, so I have to focus on the front around the hairline and kind of the low part of the back of the head because nothing else is going to be visible. So I was thinking it might be fun to give her a little bit of face framing like this and gather up those strands in the back and make a little bun underneath the hat. This way, I still get that wonderful effect of the wild fall of curls while still giving her a hairstyle specific to her character that distinguishes her from Breeze. Now I'm going to wrap up all that hair to protect it. I'm going to use cloth this time because the plastic was a bit unwieldy last time. Now she looks like a tiny nun. Or like Olenna Tyrell. Now that it was time to reattach the head, I started to get nervous about the sheer amount of pins stabbed into this thing. I don't know how well you can see it, but if you look inside, it's just a complete crisscrossing spiderweb of metal pins. So I was started to get worried that there wasn't going to be enough room for the neck peg inside old Pinhead here. Still, I bravely forged ahead, heating up the vinyl with a hairdryer to soften it up. But just as I feared, the pins were definitely in the neck peg's way. You can see me here having a heck of a time getting the thing past them. And it definitely pushed more than a few out of place. So I did what I usually do in these situations, made a few minor modifications that were convenient to me, and then brute forced it. But as is often the case with this method, while it basically got me what I wanted, it also had the undesirable side effect of driving a pin down through the doll's jaw. Fortunately for me, I was able to pull the pins back out till it wasn't visible anymore. Just goes to show, children, do as I say, not as I do. Across the fence in my neighbor's yard, there is a turkey. Notorious doll thieves, turkeys are. Just look at this sinister creature. We'd better work quickly then. I'm gonna do her entire body because I want to blush it. Despite thieves lurking. With that done, it is time to tackle the face-up. Now, I confess to finding the concept of doing face-ups to be intimidating. They're a real challenge to my painting and drawing skill, and since the soul of the doll, really the personality of it, resides primarily in the face, if you don't do a good job with it, the project kind of fails as a whole. So I have to be a little bit brave here and just commit to doing it, even if I possibly mess it up. I'm going to start with chalk pastels, loading up my palette with as many shades of green as I've got. I'm going to use this to try and get some color variation into her skin, to bring some life and dimension to the flat-colored plastic. Now the idea is to define the natural planes of the face by using darker colors to make features recede from the eye and lighter colors to move features closer to the eye. And while I want that definition and variation, I don't want it to look like she's wearing makeup. So I need to do my best to make these shadows and highlights seem natural. It's real easy with a heavy hand to let this tip over into Instagram contour. It's also an interesting challenge with the green skin to decide sort of what blushed and shadowed places would look like on somebody with her coloring. I considered, for example, putting some actual pink rosiness into her cheeks, but then I decided it would probably look a little bit too much like makeup, and I didn't want that artificiality in her style. I picture her spending all of her time running around in the woods, digging in the dirt for herbs and mushrooms and stuff that she could turn into potions, so having her with a more natural look seemed appropriate. The tools I'm using include a variety of small brushes, particularly this sort of round flat one that is specifically for painting miniatures, that I'm kind of using similarly to how you would, a beauty blender or a kabuki brush for makeup, as well as a kneaded eraser and some cotton gloves so I can sort of soften all of the lines that I'm making. Then, once I've done enough on her face, I move down to blush her body. And I'm following basically the same principles. Anything I want to seem deeper, I'm going over with the darker colors, and I'm using a lighter color to make all the high points stand out. Of course, all this is going to get covered up by her clothes, but, it's the thought that counts. Then it's time for another layer of Mr. Super Clear to keep all of this powder set. I absolutely cannot work on a doll out here without somebody coming to creep on it. She brought reinforcements this time. Then I transition to the acrylic paint on brushes, which I find this step particularly challenging because the fineness of the line work that doing a really good job on a doll's face requires is just really hard for me. Maybe my brushes aren't good enough, maybe my skills aren't developed enough, but this is the part that I find particularly difficult to pull off to the level that I want. And I don't know how it works for other artists, but anytime I paint, I find that there's a lot of pulling it back and pushing it forward that I have to do. By which I mean, every time I add a little bit of paint, I find I have to take a little bit away. Or every time I make it look a little bolder, I have to go back and make it a little softer. Push the contrast forward because there's not enough, and then pull the contrast back because there's too much. That sort of thing. I can never just throw down the effect that I want. I have to get it there by inches and by a few steps forward and then a few steps back. So in this case, as I was trying to add depth to the color on her face, I found myself going back and forth between the brush and a little bit of tissue to sort of dab it away. You see again me using the round brush for softness and then the teeny tiny pointy brushes in an effort to get fine lines. This is the point where I really start to try and bring out her expression. I didn't really capture it in my concept art, but I want a sort of eager friendliness, like she's super excited about her magical crafts and cannot wait to talk about them. And that means I need to turn the rather solemn Frankie face into a smiling mouth, which the face mold does not really facilitate. And I want her eyes to be large and wide open. And I found myself having to draw and redraw the eye shape, because the angle of the eyelid was giving her the wrong expression, or because the eye whites weren't symmetrical anymore. I confess I was kind of worried about how she was turning out until I broke out the watercolor pencils. And I think the difference they made was twofold. One, I felt like I had more control over them and I could sharpen them to a point, so I was better able to get those refined lines that I've been struggling so much with. And also their color is a lot softer, even though I tend to dip them in water to activate the pigment a little bit before I apply them to the doll's face. I found their effect was a lot subtler than the acrylic paint, so I could build up the effect with them rather than putting on too much and then having to pull it back the way I was. Finally, I brought out the acrylic paint pens to finish up the lips and the eyes. And they have a similar problem to me using the brushes because they're not quite as fine as I would like, and the color they apply is really strong. But like the pencils, I do feel like my control over them is slightly better than it is with a brush. And I ended up switching between all these tools to sort of put the finishing touches on the face, like the variation in the purple eyes that I thought would make for a good accent with all the green, and refining the lips so that they actually looked like a smile. I was really pleased with the effect of just putting a little drop of white paint into the lip crevice in order to give that suggestion of teeth. And I did a lot of subtle refining at this stage to make sure that expression really came through, in order to really convey the kind of character that I was thinking of. I was really excited to get to make a witch character. I'm not a very witchy person myself, but I think the aesthetic and the idea is really cool. And I always really enjoy stories that are about witches. Some of my favorite witch characters are Morwen from the Enchanted Forest Chronicles by Patricia C. Reed, Granny Weatherwax from the Discworld books by Terry Pratchett, and Agatha Harkness from the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Although my character here is more of a witch from birth type, sort of like the Wicked Witch of the West, rather than like a human who studied witchcraft and took it up. So though I enjoy the visual arts, you can probably tell by the fact that I'm not that practiced at them that they're not my primary creative pursuit. As you may or may not know, I am mostly a dramatist and a film and theater artist. I have an MFA in creative writing for stage and screen, and my primary project is that I do a Victorian adventure stage show that I pitch as What If Sherlock Holmes Were Like a Lady Batman, which I call Mrs. Hawking. And even though putting on plays and films is a pretty different craft, it actually can teach you a lot about character design. If you're going to translate a character that used to exist only as words on a page into the real world, and you want your audience to be able to understand who they are, you are going to have to make a lot of effective visual choices that communicate things about them. You think about what they look like and move like and sound like when you're picking the actor. You style their costume and their makeup and their hair. You think about the sort of things that they do and how they do them. And all the while, you are thinking what impression this is going to be making on the people that are looking at them who may not necessarily know all the backstory and things in your imagination. So I find myself applying a lot of those skills when I'm conceiving of a doll like this. Like, for example, I know based on directing actors that certain facial expressions convey friendliness better than other ones. So I'm going to try and apply that to creating this character. Though I know I'm much better at it in the theatrical and filmic context than I am here in this visual arts one. So if you ever want to check out Mrs. Hawking, there's a link to the shows in the description box. You can watch them free here on YouTube. Now to finish off her face, I give her eyebrows using 2 little dots of super glue and a few fibers of the same red yarn I used for her hair. I really liked how the 3D eyebrows worked out on Breeze, so I thought I'd try them again. And I'm very careful about the angle and placement because I think that eyebrows have a huge power over the expression that the doll has on her face, and I really want to maintain that friendly, eager look I was working so hard for. And that's the finished face! Again, not as refined or as delicate as I'd like my line work to be, but I think that the character comes through. The major design feature of this doll is the costume, and I'm going to be using pieces of 3 different patterns to make it. Starting with the white blouse that I'm going to be making out of a remnant from a shirt I took in for the character of Roland Davies, played by my good friend Andrew Prentice in Mrs. Hawking Part 5. One thing that's nice about making doll clothes is that you can use up some scraps because you don't actually need all that much fabric. And I'm using the blouse pattern with the smaller sleeve heads from Requiem Art Designs Victorian dress. Now to assemble this, I am going to put in threads at the collar line and the waistline in order to create gathers. Then laboriously and at great length, pin the tiny collar piece to the neckline, then hand stitch it in place so I can flip it right side out to make a high collar. Then I put the sleeves in place and sew them into the shoulders. Then I fold and pin the outside seams together and sew them up along the sides. I think this might be the first sleeve I've ever set in, and it's at doll scale. Now I've got to turn the right sides out using a pen to help me flip the tiny tubes. Then, with some threads clipped, I have got a tiny puffy sleeved blouse. For the overdress, I'm going to use the fabric from this wool tie that I got from a thrift store, which is another great source of cheap quality fabric when you only need a little bit for doll clothes. And the pattern I picked is the frock coat, also from Requiem Art Designs, which, through no fault of the pattern's own, turned out not to be a great choice for this. Sharp-eyed viewers may notice it now, but it didn't occur to me until later, so we will address it when I notice it then. The tie didn't have quite enough fabric for me to cut the front and back as one whole piece, so I decided to cut the pattern piece at the shoulder and just plan on seaming them there. Then, because the wool was kind of ravelly, I coated all the edges with fray check, which left a little bit of a stain and burned a little bit under the iron, but ultimately kept the pieces together. Then I pinned the pieces together at the shoulders and the sides. And these I decided to do on the sewing machine. This is my machine. I inherited it from my mother, who bought it in the early 2000s, and it's still going pretty strong. I believe it's a Singer Scholastic 6518. I am hardly an expert with it, but I do know the basics, and I wound myself a little brown bobbin to match the fabric. And I tried to go very slowly and carefully since I am not used to sewing at this scale. Then I pressed the seams open on an ironing board whose cover I really need to replace. So seemed like so far so good, but when I put it on the Create a Monster doll I'm using as a mannequin, the problems started to show themselves. First of all, the fit was pretty wide for what I wanted, probably because it was designed to be a coat rather than a dress, while the arm size were a bit narrow to get the puffy sleeves through. But then, most damning of all, I realized that it was too short, when I wanted the overdress to be about ballet length, and which I should have noticed when I was picking the pattern. What to do? I decided I was going to try and save it. I did some clipping at the armholes to make them a little bit wider. Then I took a pinch out from Monster High's ridiculous amount of sway back and re-sewed that. And with the excess clipped, it was already starting to look a little bit better, but that still didn't solve the problem of the length. So I went back to my concept art, and I thought that maybe I could conceive of it more as like a bustle vest rather than a dress. And if I emphasized that, I could sort of still capture the vibe I was going for. So very carefully, I took my scissors to cut the thing into more of a bustle vest shape. Then I cut out a circle for the overskirty trainee part. Had to be pretty careful here because the downside of a tie is that there isn't a lot of fabric to screw up with. Then I sewed it to the piece using a blind hem so that the stitches wouldn't show in the back. Now for the skirt, which is the most important part of the costume. I'm going to be using this scrap of linen and another piece of the same Victorian pattern from Requiem Art Designs. Cutting it a bit shorter here because I want to be able to see her shoes. And didn't bother to change my machine thread because the color's not going to be visible. And why is that? Because I am going to be covering it with patchwork. I dug through my stash of fabric scraps and pulled out as wide a variety of colors and patterns as I could find. Then I cut the scraps down to size. And next came actually putting them on the skirt. Now obviously the proper way to make a patchwork is probably to quilt it. And I did consider that, but ultimately I decided against doing any actual sewing because these pieces are super tiny. Many of them are very ravelly, and because they all came from different sources, the pieces didn't always fit together neatly. I have minimal experience of quilting, and I am not the most skilled seamstress at the best of times, and at this teeny tiny scale with all those problems, I just thought it was going to end up kind of being a mess. So I decided my best bet was to glue it. I bought myself a flexible fabric glue, and I used it to affix the patches as well as seal up any of the fraying edges. My goal when placing the patches was to keep them looking as varied and random as I could, trying to keep pieces of the same fabric away from each other, as well as separate anything that was too similar in color. That nice visual variety was paramount to the effect I was going for. When all the patches were on, I decided it was looking a little bit messy, so I was trying to think of some ways to finish the edges. I put a scrap of lace along the bottom. I love that effect of a little bit of lace peeking out from beneath a full skirt. And after another dig through my stash, I found this little dark red ribbon that I thought I could use to sort of bind the raw edges. And I threw in some of that thicker pink kind to make a waistband. Finally, I sewed some more ribbon in to keep the skirt from riding up on the doll's body and a couple of snaps to be the closure. The last major thing I had to make for her was her witch's hat, which I used the pattern that Delightful kindly offers for free in her K-Ren video. I'm making it out of the same wool as I made the overdress from, which is why I had to be a little bit careful about how much I used up. I cut out the 3 layers needed for the brim, the wool, the inner lining, and the cardboard I'm using for interfacing, and then I glued them together. Next, I sewed and turned a cone of just the wool to make the crown of the hat. Used the scissors to keep it extra pointy. Then I glued down the bottom edge to the cardboard before hiding the seam with the black lining fabric. At this point, it was looking a little bit messy for my taste, so I cut a long strip of the wool from the tie, and I glued it around the brim of the hat as like a kind of binding to neaten up the edge. I put on the paper clips to hold it in place as it dried. Then, because I didn't like how visible the glue was underneath the lining, I decided to cut one more circle of the black to cover it up and just make it look a little bit neater. I was also trying out Oohoo glue for the first time, which I've seen a number of customizers use. It was then I started thinking about her shoes, which I wasn't quite up to fabricating them from scratch, but luckily enough, I happen to live with a mad scientist who likes to play around with his 3D printer. So I downloaded an STL file from the website Cults 3D. They're modeled after the high-heeled Congress boots that came with the original G1 Ghoulia Yelps doll. And they were put together by Meow Maker's Lab, who I have linked to in the description box. So, STL acquired, I handed off the file to Dr. Bernie to put on the slicer, and he took it down to our little garage printing laboratory for fabrication. And now, after washing and curing, here they are. They're a little bit less flexible than I hoped they'd be, but I like how crisp all the details are. And while they've got a little bit of excess plastic on them left over from the supports, it's nothing I can't trim off. I borrowed the pair of snips that Bernie has exactly for this purpose in printing. Then I filed the heels smooth with my little rasp and some fine grit sandpaper. Next comes the painting. I started with a base coat of plain brown acrylic, which I applied in 3 or 4 watery layers until it was opaque. Then I dry brushed it with metallic bronze and stippled it with a bit of black to give some texture. After a bit of pat drying with a paper towel, here's how they turned out. Since I knew I was getting close to the end, I decided to do a few things to kind of smarten up the rest of the outfit. I found this dark red ribbon in my stash and I decided to sew it around the edge of the overdress just to make it look a little bit cleaner and provide a bit of contrast. Then I took that same black and metallic bronze paint that I used on the boots and stippled it over the entirety of the overdress and the hat, so the texture would be a little more interesting. Finally, I took one of the ribbons that I'd incorporated into the patchwork skirt and I turned that into a hat band. Then as one last finishing touch, I took a real blue jay feather that I found in my aviary of a backyard and put it in as a plume. Don't worry, I put it in the freezer for a couple of weeks to make sure nothing was living on it. The only thing left to make was her hairstyle, so I was pretty excited to cut the hair free from the wrap and see what it looked like with the face. Oh, I love it! I think it works really well together and the color combination is great. I ended up going with a slightly different style than I planned. Rather than pulling it back from the face, I decided that would make her look a little bit too much like Breeze. I just gathered up some of the hair in the back to make the bun. I sort of tied it in a knot around itself, low on her neck, and then stuck it in place with a human-sized bobby pin. Then using the same technique as last time of looping them through a needle and thread, I strung various kinds of beads, mostly wooden ones, but a few shiny plastic and even a couple of the same metal as Bree wears, all through her hair. And again, sorry for using the same style twice in 2 doll videos. I promise next time I will do something different. And yes, I threw a few braids in there too. I just think that these voluminous waves with beads in them is just so pretty. And since her hair was so long, I decided to give it a little bit of a trim. I didn't really know what I was doing. So I tried to coax it into being longest at the very back and then a little bit shorter as it went up the sides. God, good thing I've never tried to cut my own long hair. And with this, let's put her together. And here she is! I've decided to call her Branwen in honor of Morwen from the Enchanted Forest Chronicles. She actually came out even better than I was expecting, given that I kind of felt like I was struggling with the clothes here, and with the face a little bit too. It was also an interesting experience to use the pink mannequin doll, because the color scheme was really not designed for that pink skin. So when I finally got the clothes on the green skin doll with the red hair like I was intending all along, it just sort of clicked into place in a way that I was kind of hoping it would, but couldn't really see during the process. She's definitely kind of amateur working. I'm going to have to work on my fine brush skills and on my sewing skills, especially at this tiny scale. But I think she's more than the sum of her parts altogether, and I'm really proud of myself for coming up with an interesting color scheme, given that I usually kind of default to one bright and a few neutrals.
And there you have it, folks. That was a lot of fun. I feel like I had a lot of gaps in my skills revealed to me, but I learned a lot of things and I enjoyed the process, and now I have a better idea of what I need to do in order to improve. So this was time very well spent. So if you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe. Stick around for more doll videos, other creative projects of mine. If you'd like to check out my Mrs. Hawking show, the link is below, and I've also got Monster High stop motion videos that are also linked. So give them a look if that sounds fun to you. Thanks for spending the time with me today. Bye for now.